stores as often as she would like, but she continuously finds ways to reuse and remake unused clothing. She is an advocate for sustainable clothing, and she often speaks out against the fast fashion industry. And the library discovered Amita out of an article that was published in the newspaper, in centraljersey.com, where she was interviewed, and she had done a fellowship to do research on the dangers of the fast fashion industry to the environment. And as a result, she had made a website about it. So we knew that we were going to do this panel, we had to find her. So we did some research because we're librarians. And I found her father on LinkedIn and said, need your daughter to come and talk about fast fashion for her Take It Back website to help her spread awareness about the impact of fast fashion on the environment. So Amita, I'm going to turn on the lights and let you take it away. This microphone is live if you can read it. There you go.
All right, I think the best place to start with all of this is why I started to care about fast fashion, and I realized a lot of people my age, and specifically my generation.
It's not coming across.
So the reason, the reason I started getting into fast fashion was because I realized a lot of people of my age and in my generation weren't very aware of the effects of fast fashion and what it was actually doing to the environment. They were most focused on getting clothing they liked and like the type of clothing that they wanted. So fast fashion. What is fast fashion? Fast fashion is inexpensive clothing produced rapidly by mass market retailers in hopes to keep up with latest trends and whatever's going on with the internet or just in society in general. And I think a large majority of you, or maybe some of you, know about Shein and Romway. They're very popular. They are internet brands that are also fast fashion brands. And I think specifically they're popular with my generation, Generation Z. As of recently, that's something that a couple of brands that people don't know about are Urban Outfitters and Guess are also fast fashion brands, which you wouldn't normally expect. So why is it harmful? Fast fashion is harmful to the environment and just ethics in general to humanity. It's various reasons why it's harmful. One of the reasons is that it is highly toxic dyes and heavy metals that are put into the environment constantly because of how fast everything is being produced, and because of that they are non-renewable and there's no proper disposal. So a lot of times these different materials of dyes and heavy metals end up in toxic landfills, they end up in waterways, oceans, rivers, anything. Also, 35% of all microplastics are from synthetic fibers, and 342 million barrels of oil are used each year to produce said synthetic fibers. So it can be seen how much it's taking from the earth and how much it's giving back in a negative way. So another reason why fast fashion is terrible is because of the ethical reasons and because of how it affects humanity. So this can be seen through how it's even produced through factories. A lot of the factories are sweatshops, and because of that they are very unethical use, and they don't treat their workers fairly. It's very unsafe conditions, long hours, low wages, and when it comes to low wages, it's either low wages or no wages, which basically means that these factories are promising these individuals work for housing, because a lot of times they're in the middle of villages. So they're like, we'll give you housing if you come to us and work in our factories, but a lot of the times that doesn't end up happening, and there's either no housing or there are plastic tents and plastic huts outside of the factories. They also enable child labor, and America has fought so hard to stop child labor and make sure that's something that's not being used in factories. So we should be enabling other countries to be using child labor in order to get products that are in our nation. Also, it affects villages. So a lot of times these factories are in third world countries, and they're right in the middle of larger villages. So it takes over hundreds of houses, which leaves a lot of people homeless, and it also forces these local villagers to work in these factories, because in order to live in their homes or keep living where they want to, they have to work in these factories to get that money and be able to live. So things to consider. Although the stuff that I mentioned is negative and it should definitely be taken into account, there are things to consider of why people would want to buy from fast fashion, and the three main reasons are convenience, accessibility, and affordability. So especially when talking about affordability and accessibility, it's really important not to shame, because a lot of the times fast fashion is being used because of low-income families. So a lot of low-income families, or the families that live in specific environments, can't access any other clothing other than fast fashion because it's what they have, it's their budget. So it's really important not to shame and just to educate and maybe push people towards alternative solutions. So what are these alternative solutions? I have 4 listed today that I'd like to talk about, but it's important to keep in mind that there are so many more. So the first one is making clothing. So there's this common misconception that for making clothing, you need to have a sewing machine, you need to have needles, you need to know how to work with that. But in reality, those materials are actually not needed in order to create clothing or make something that you want to wear. So A couple ways this can be seen is through customizing clothing. And customizing can be just styling things differently, but it can also be putting things on your clothing. So styling things differently could be, let's say you have a t-shirt in your closet that you see all the time, but you don't really want to wear, it doesn't fit your style anymore. You can make that same t-shirt into a scarf or a skirt that would be a staple in your closet from then on. And customizing could also be writing things or drawing things on your clothing, and then or using other pieces of fabric to translate that and put that onto your other piece of clothing. An example of customizing is actually what I'm wearing right now. I drew on an old shirt of mine. I liked the design. I was like, it's a plain white shirt. What's the point of just letting it go to waste or throwing it away? I might as well draw on it, and that's something I did for customizing. There's also hand-me-downs. So hand-me-downs is almost like your own personal thrift store. So although the idea is not very appealing from getting clothing from your parents or siblings or friends, it could act as your own personal thrift store, and it makes it so that you can explore so many different styles and so many different clothing items without having to spend any money or being wasteful with your cloth. And that kind of also goes to clothing swaps. I think Jamie was mentioning this earlier, but clothing swaps can be for not only could it be in your friend group, but it could be smaller communities, internet communities. Let's say you find something in your friend's closet that you really like. You could try that on and then maybe give them something from your closet that they like, and you could swap clothing that way. It could be borrowing clothing, but it could also be like permanent. You could give them your clothing and they could give you yours. It's also a great way to build community, because clothing, I think, is a very personal and intimate thing for each person. It describes them as a person. It describes how they want to present themselves. It really shows who they are. So having that as an opportunity to just be there when people like want to get to know you or want to use your clothing is also something that could really help to build community. The second way, because we're talking about personal thrifting, we should talk about actual thrifting. So thrifting is a very cheap and very creative way to get new clothing. It also enables you to be very unique, and it allows you to experiment with so many different types of styles. But before we get into thrifting, I think it's really important to discuss about the stigma around thrifting. And there's this huge uneasy feeling that a lot of people feel when going to thrift stores, and this uncomfortable environment where people assume that clothing in thrift stores is dirty or it's unused or unwashed. And that's definitely not true, and it's really important to define that before you tell people to go thrifting. Because a lot of thrift stores actually reject clothing, or they divert clothing if it's not properly washed, if it's not in proper condition, and it's not, it can't last for very long. So, and something that's also, I think people don't really consider about thrift stores is that some of the clothing in thrift stores could also be new. So a lot of companies, a lot of major companies, typically print things in bulk, and then the excess clothing they give out to thrift stores or smaller shops. So I think that's definitely appealing for people in my generation that really want that vintage style or like vintage feel to certain types of clothing. So I know people in my generation are always looking for like vintage Nike or vintage whatever, and that is typically something you can find in thrift stores, because these big companies are buying things in bulk and giving the excess to thrift stores, so they can not only get these new clothing for a cheaper price, but it's also typically newer and no one has really worn it, so it's a great solution that way. Another thing that's similar to thrifting is selling and trading clothing online. So the internet is a wonderful place to be when it comes to sustainability. It's definitely some place where you can spread awareness, but it's also some place where you could figure out what you want to do with it. So the internet could also be like, whether it be websites that you're putting your clothing out on and trying to get more clothing off of, you could also use social media, whether that be Twitter or Instagram. And this is, I guess, more for people my age when it comes to Twitter and Instagram, but finding like hashtags and trying to push your clothing, but also push the type of clothing that you want to come into your feed. And then the fourth solution that I have here today is a bit more on the expensive side, so it's something that may not be as appealing, but it's something that should be considered, and it's buying from sustainable brands. So sustainable brands could be Pact, it could be Patagonia, and although these brands are more on the expensive side, something to consider is the fact that they do last longer because they're built to last longer. So something you get from Patagonia, like a sweater for example, could last you 5 to 10 or more years. So all these are like really important things to consider when you want to know how you are going to shop sustainably. And something just really important about sustainability in general that should be discussed is sustainability is all about trying new things and trying different things and being unconventional. So if you are being unconventional, then you know you're doing something right. So there's no set rules, just be yourself when it comes to shopping. And the last thing I want to talk about is I do have a website called Take It Back, and Jane introduced that, but it does talk about all things fast fashion and just like environmentally friendly stuff. So if you do have more questions or you do want to just look into that, that would be great. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Amita. Take a turn, show off that shirt that you're wearing that you created yourself. It looks wonderful. And thank you for all that great information. And yes, clothing swap. Speaking of that, I'll just actually, since you mentioned that, yeah, I've